Many thanks, Rosalind. It is an honor to be with everyone. It's an honor to have Lora as the co-presenter. It's been a lot of warm moments preparing this together at distance. We're going to share the reading out responsibilities, and I'll be taking care of moving the slides forward. Here we go. In the 1940s and 1950s, Montreal artist Ghitta Caiserman produced an extensive range of prints and drawings in which she dealt with the politics of war, of class struggle, and of the self in society through an engagement with modernist codes of figurative representation. As one decade gave way to the next, changes in the North American political climate appear to have coincided with a shift in her chosen imagery, which becomes more elusive and personal, referencing women's experience through reference to religious and domestic themes. In this presentation, we chart the first 20 years of Caiserman's career in order to situate her work against what has become the standard later modernist narrative of a teleological path to abstraction, in order to recover her preoccupation with subjectivity and with reference to the artist's body and space as a harbinger of feminist concerns that also mark Canadian artistic practice in the second half of the 20th century.
In 1943, at the age of 20, Ghitta Caiserman had already undergone long and thorough training, having earned an honorable mention at the Art Association of Montreal Spring Exhibition at age 13. With a family background in socialist pro-union activism, she attended from 1939 to 43, the Parsons School of Design, American Artist School, and the Art Students League, spending summers in Montreal. Her work in a munitions factory led to the etching The Night Shift, shown here at the left, and she made lithographs consistent with the socialist politics of her time. The oniric spaces familiar in both etching and lithograph point to very different preoccupations that meld social and personal to very different degrees. In both cases, she keeps with a long tradition that associated graphic media with popular art, emphasizing through centralized compositions of lights and darks and the bold deployment of crayon textures, the instant readability of that graphic tradition and its aptness for socially active art.
After the war, we find her active in left-wing communist-affiliated papers such as the Canadian Tribune, where similar techniques are marshaled towards peacetime issues, dignity for workers, for returning vets, and the lack of government support for social security, schools, and nurseries in Maurice Duplessis' Quebec.
While drawing and printmaking would remain central to Ghitta Caiserman's work all her life, she had trained as a painter from childhood, and here Men Loading, painted in 1945, is strong evidence of her level of accomplishment. She said later, "It was a rhythmic thing, my first real painting," and it is indeed driven by an organic rhythm. Each of the three workers is made distinct by subtle color, but more obviously this rhythm unites them in the effort they exert. The painting's subject is an outcome of her longtime commitment to the social, brought to a personal level during a year when she and her new husband, Albert Pinsky, lived with a working class family in Halifax. Returning to Montreal, she started teaching part-time, first at the Montreal Artist School, which she and Alfred Pinsky founded in 1946, and elsewhere afterwards throughout much of her career. And as she later said, teaching was a side of her professional life that allowed her the time and money to make her own art, gave her a critical perspective on what she made, as well as the language to articulate that perspective. She began a vigorous practice of exhibiting. There were regular society shows in her home city and elsewhere in Canada, but also almost immediately she began to be seen abroad. In 1947, her paintings were chosen for both the Exhibition of Canadian Women Artists in New York, to which Saul Field refers in this important 1949 piece for the Bulletin of the Canadian Jewish Congress, and the Festival Mondial de la Jeunesse Démocratique in Prague. Montreal's private galleries took up her work too. The West End Gallery, opened by Rose Millman in 1949, specialized in Canadian art and more particularly in women artists, including Caiserman. And in the 50s, the Dominion Gallery became her agent. In 1959, she had a solo show at Waddington, and so it went throughout her long career. Street Scene of 1948 is an example of the cityscapes she was doing in the late 40s and early 50s. It's broadly conceived and so rigorously constructive that at first you scarcely notice the dozen or so figures along the street. The low winter sun enters between the building, picking out details and colors on the left, but the figures themselves are in the shadows. Unusually, the Montreal cityscapes do focus on architecture and streets, though in her lifetime of work, she focused very much on humanity. This was painted just as gestural abstraction and non-objective art were beginning to have their heyday in Montreal, in New York, and really everywhere it seemed. Caiserman stayed apart from the sweeping movement, though of course he was very conscious of it. She commented in 1957 that, quote, "With almost everybody on the other side, I think we have to be better painters to make our points. Our surfaces, for instance, have to be just as exciting as, say, bourgeois surfaces." And a few years later, she said, "Rembrandt interests me as much as Riopel." One is reminded of Candida Rifkin's point that the term modernism is increasingly understood to include, and I'm quoting, "the many and varied artistic developments, both transcultural and asynchronic, elite and popular, of the cultural and institutional formations of modernity." It should be pointed out here that Caiserman never forgot for long the horrors of the Holocaust. In the 1947 lithograph, Underground, the traditions of caricature, which she knew well, came into play, but this stark image has nothing in it of the irony and humor that are so often elements of those traditions. Here, horror dominates and is forcefully present in the absence of nature, the broken building, the brute force of the Nazi soldiers, the ghost-like murdered figures, and the desperation of the living. But the living are also witnessing, which is what Caiserman herself is doing. Her paintings would usually be more allusive than this lithograph when they approach the subject, but they did sometimes approach it. For an artist continually involved in Montreal's very active Jewish cultural community, there would have been constant and inevitable reminders of the losses and violence inflicted by the Holocaust. In the late 80s, she commented, for instance, that some recent canvases of anonymous figures undressing might have been subconscious references to inmates preparing themselves for the gas chambers in Nazi death camps. The Cold War period was overall an uneasy time. Today, we have very little sense of how very much people found the world had been changed by the Holocaust, the war, and the atomic bomb. In the late 40s, the talk of a possible nuclear war was inescapable. The artist Peggy Nichol wrote to a friend in 1947, "The world is in a desperate state of fear right now, and so things tighten and become tense." And she added, of course, artists reflect that. And Charles Comfort spoke of the woefully changed psychology of the present generation of artists who were deprived of the security felt by the post-World War I generation. In what one French-Canadian report called the veritable atomic atmosphere of the time, artists could make any number of responses. And of course, one couldn't say any one of those is a direct outcome of that atmosphere, but it may be appropriate to look at Caiserman's turn toward a more personal, interior approach to art against the background of this atmosphere. Drawing now comes strongly into play, and the freedom and exploration of the unconscious that drawing gave affects her painting greatly. One could even see first steps with the self-portrait in the mirror on the floor as postmodern, in his freedom from modernist attention to the qualities of meaning, for instance, and in its distance from the concerns of an art world that placed abstract expressionism at its apex. His construction of a domestic reality that is given concreteness and whatever certainty one could achieve in that era. It steps also towards a feminism that grew out of such concerns.
The collection of prints held by Bibliothèque et Archives Nationales du Québec shows us just what scope exists for deeper work into Ghitta Caiserman's work for the 1950s. On the left, brushing her hair at the foot of a circular wooden staircase, such as might link the rear areas of 2 duplex apartments, or have provided access between floors for servants in the pre-war eras, this young woman is attentive to something outside the image frame, attentive too to her hair as she sits on a towel or a robe, a bowl beside her. We have strong indications of her subjectivity and of her social and built environment, offering us signs of being a young woman in a certain kind of space at a certain time in mid-20th century Montreal, for all that the simplified, energetic lithographic crayon work tends towards an almost non-specific and compositionally determined geometric structure. At the right, we take this to be a self-portrait of the artist at her home. Again, a few interior features, the double doors, the radiator, the construction of the dwelling seen beyond the balcony, they all serve to suggest what has become a well-loved kind of Montreal apartment. This 1953 color lithograph is in keeping with a theme that Caiserman will return to time and time again throughout her career. Home. Home is studio, the interior opening onto the outside world as a key aspect of both home and studio. At its most focused, this emphasis comes to rest on the objects, or the fragments, as she names them here, of the studio. The fairly stark placement of these objects in a horizontal procession, even the artist's hand holding charcoal or lithographic sticks, is a fragment among the spray can, the scissors, the cup, the boxes, the plate or the palette, the pail, the pencils, the book, the brushes that are in tins. The studio of the lithographer is unlikely to be home as such, but home will perhaps be the place of conception. And then the lithography studio is also a place of intimacies and experiences quite distinct from one another, pinned to different tools, to different parts of the artist's body. We see these works of the 1950s as part of the tide of work by women artists that place the problems and opportunities of what can be done with art elsewhere than in the formalist concerns of many of their male contemporaries. We expect also to have much to think about when we think of Caiserman confronting deep-seated iconographies associated with a certain masculine imprint on art history, such as Rembrandt's, for example, whose 1638 painting, The Wedding Feast of Samson, was the basis of a series in which Caiserman appears to have above all sought to have reinvested the nameless bride-to-be at the center of the composition with all the burden of her fate. Chosen by Samson from among the families of the Philistines, the drama of her story turns on a riddle posed by Samson to her kinfolk, a riddle whose answer she will reveal to them, with much smiting and slaughtering ensuing, including eventually her own death by fire at the hands of her own people. This biblical turn in Caiserman's work is surely to be thought through carefully if we consider its emphasis on identity and on the loss of subjective agency in its very exercise, on the meaning of home and its relationship to studio in her work, and the enigmatic imagery for which Caiserman so often strives in these years, as if, despite her graphic training, not everything could be said quite so directly. Thank you.